Well, thank you so much. Good evening. And thank you so much, Mark, and to everyone at Global Minnesota for the kind invitation and the export coordination of this event. It really is such an extraordinary group. I've been learning about all of the members and all of the supporters, and it's such a pleasure to have the opportunity to address you all here on this virtual platform tonight. Um, had I given this, and I'll share my presentation in a moment, but let me just preface it by saying that had I given this talk just a few months ago, I think it would have looked very different from what I'm planning to say today. It's so much is changing in the relationship and in the global landscape for that matter, really on a weekly, if not daily basis. And for those of you who have read my article in Global Decisions, you already have a good sense of the main points that I tend to generally offer audiences during these sorts of talks. I note, for example, that China's relationship with Latin America is a long-standing one. It's a historical one that dates back many, many decades, um, generally through sort of political engagement in the 1960s, 50s, 70s, for example. But one that really ramped up in the 1990s when China introduced what was called the going out strategy, which promoted a number of different things, but mostly overseas acquisition of raw materials, things like soy from Brazil and Argentina, things like copper and other minerals from Peru and Chile. Uh, and then also the development of new export markets. Latin America has some very large countries, large export markets, and that was, originally speaking, at least, a very important um, driver for much of the initial engagement with the region. Also, this strategy promoted the internationalization of Chinese companies, and these are factors that still, drive much of what China is doing in the region. That said, the relationship has evolved considerably over the past couple of decades, especially as China develops considerable capacity in a much wider range of industries. No longer is China just producing plastic buckets or other low value added items for sale across the world. Textiles, shoes, things of that nature, but is increasingly active in a range of ultra high tech industries. And there anything from telecommunications to AI enabled technologies, smart cities, electricity transmission, ultra high voltage electricity transmission. And so all of this still holds true. The relationship is evolving very quickly. There's still some really important fundamentals that are driving a lot of the engagement. But now I think we're really in the midst of yet another big transition. And so rather than looking back and talking to you about, how things have evolved, what I'd like to do today is address, I think, a wide range of factors: geopolitical factors, domestic economic factors, local politics, you name it, that that are likely to shape the China-Latin America relationship in the coming years. I'm just making sure you all can hear me. My screen is a bit frozen, so hopefully all is well on the communication side. So let me get started with the presentation. And oh, good, thank you, Carolina. Great. So what I'd like to do today is to address three factors in particular that I think are likely to influence China-Latin America in important ways, really in the coming months and years, and some of these are already shaping the relationship. There is evidence of that happening. There are, of course, many, many factors, some of them sort of yet unpredictable, right, that will shape China-Latin America dynamics. Or even particular bilateral relationships. And I've noted a few others here at the bottom of the screen as just some examples of things that we can consider as we think about what the relationship might look like in the coming years. But since I have less than an hour and I want to really be able to pay due attention to these top three, the extent and speed of China's own recovery, the nature of China's stimulus, right? What will China do exactly to promote recovery? That will have implications for the region. And then talk a little bit about regional views of China's handling of COVID and the various sub-factors that influence that. So first of all, as we all know, Latin America's recovery will, of course, depend to a considerable extent on the nature and speed of China's own recovery. And that can, of course, be said of the entire global economy. But as a result of especially strong trade ties and other really critical linkages between China and many countries in the Latin American region, these two actors are really intricately linked in a very special way. So much so that a 1 percentage point drop in China's growth amounts to a full 1 percentage point drop in growth in the Latin American region. So with that in mind, the good news is that China does appear to be getting on track, back on track to at least a certain degree economically, with clear gains in manufacturing. And you can see that here in the first sort of top left graph. Industrial production too, we're seeing a sort of V-shaped recovery in both of those areas, and also on property, in the property market and real estate transactions. Even so, it is experiencing and has experienced already some cumulative losses that will have severe effects on the country's economic well-being in the longer term. Here, I mean, there are many, many examples of this, but here's some data on job losses, which are really pretty extensive in certain sectors in particular over the course of this year. This is the data over the course of the entire year. Also slowing export growth. Exports have been slumping, and China is working very hard to try to boost those. And then, of course, local debt will continue to be a pressing challenge for China's financial system as China considers how best to stimulate its economy and how extensively to do so. And even despite China's recovery, the region is still feeling the effects of slowing slowing demand from China in certain sectors. This is especially true in the oil sector, and the effects are expected to worsen even as things get back on track in China. China is already at capacity in terms of storage of oil, having purchased a lot at very low prices in recent months, and so now is not in as much need of large quantities of imports. So things are not looking particularly good for Latin American exports of oil at this moment, to China in particular, but globally speaking too. And even despite China's recovery, there is also concern among regional governments at this phase about the fate of many of the deals that Chinese companies have struck with Latin American governments over the past couple of years. And you can see here in this graph that in 2019, we saw a relative boom in Chinese greenfield foreign direct investment announcements. There was somewhat of a drop in mergers and acquisitions, but a huge boom in greenfield announcements and deals that were sort of initially struck with governments, local and federal, across the region. And you can see that much of that was in infrastructure. One port in Peru in particular, the Chancay port, took up a major portion of that. But and this was to the tune, as you can see, of about $12 billion, really a huge surge. But what will happen with these deals, right? Now that everyone really is struggling with the economic implications and many other implications of COVID-19. I think it's likely that major public works and other projects will be delayed even in a best case scenario. On the one hand, China faces numerous limitations to outward investment as it grapples with challenges at home. But in any case, likely investors will confront very different realities on the ground in Latin America post-COVID-19 or in the midst of COVID-19 than they did when deals were struck, especially when we're talking about the reality of carrying out a public-private partnership. And many of the deals that were struck in 2019, whether mergers and acquisition, well, mostly greenfield deals, but mergers and acquisitions too, there were some that would be affected certainly by a lack of government intervention. Chinese state finance has also, I think it's worth noting, been on the decline in Latin America for the past 5 years, way preceding COVID-19. So we've seen a slight decrease in certain forms of activity in Latin America, even before the pandemic struck. And that's not particularly good news when we're thinking about perhaps a resurgence of activity that might boost economic growth in the region in the coming years. As you can see here, Chinese finance from the big banks, China Development Bank, China Export-Import Bank, that give most of China's development finance, infrastructure finance, has really declined rather rapidly since 2015. We saw barely anything, about 1 billion in finance in 2019 to four different countries, relatively small loans. And this compares in 2010 to about 35 billion that China gave that year, which was a peak year. So even, despite COVID-19 and the many related challenges, we saw a decline in interest in Latin America in certain very specific ways earlier on. That said, China Development Bank, which again has been one of the main financiers of especially infrastructure activity in the region, has indicated that it will provide some support for Chinese companies engaging in Belt and Road Initiative projects. I'm happy to talk in more depth in the Q&A about what the Belt and Road Initiative is and what it means for Latin America. But this bank has provided really no deals about that, or details, about that support. And of course, there's very little sign of it happening yet. So we'll see if, in fact, these many deals have been struck in 2019 and 2018 actually materialize in the coming months or years. All of that said, if China's recovery is especially robust, or if certain industries fare particularly well in the coming years, we could very well see an uptick in strategic investment from China. Maybe the investment environments in Latin America aren't all that attractive to investors from other countries, to a range of multinationals, but for China, they may be willing to take the risk to acquire strategic assets, especially if other investors withdraw from the region. I think this would, of course, be limited to some very specific sectors. For example, electricity transmission in Brazil, where China already has a very strong presence, maybe the oil sector to a certain degree, but really the conditions aren't there for that to happen at the moment. But one can envision other sectors in which a greater presence, especially across supply chains, might be of interest to China. Agriculture is one of those areas that China has really been very, very interested in establishing a sort of cross supply chain presence for several years now. My second point, if you remember from the first slide, is that future engagement with Latin America will also be shaped by the nature and extent of China's actual stimulus measures and reforms. What is China doing now to boost its economic growth? And what specifically will that mean for the Latin American region and for engagement with other regions across the world? China's stimulus is critical for China's growth, of course, which has implications for the health of the entire global economy. But the nature of China's domestic investment will also inevitably shape its overseas engagement, just as it has for many, many years. At the moment, China has approved sizable support for investment in hard infrastructure. A lot of new airports are being built, a number of other, sort of hard infrastructure projects, roads, rail, other things that, there aren't a lot of projects that China still needs to do, but certainly provinces, local governments are coming up with plans as money is provided, as China really emphasizes investment in hard infrastructure to try to revamp economic growth. But in addition to that, there is a lot of investment at the moment, or at least a considerable degree of attention being paid to what's called new infrastructure. Not roads, rail, bridges, things of that nature, but things like 5G and the broader digital economy, fixed, rather public health, but by that I mean a lot of pharmaceuticals and sort of high-tech medical equipment and services. Things like electricity transmission, automation that I mentioned. And the companies, that fare best, not only in hard infrastructure, but in this new infrastructure area that are prioritized in the stimulus, will be among those that are best positioned to invest abroad in the coming years. Also, a focus on supporting the steel sector, as part of this sort of overall focus on hard infrastructure, could result in future overseas infrastructure investment as China looks to employ its excess steel capacity. And so here, just to give you a sense of kind of how this has worked in the past, China's stimulus after the global financial crisis in 2008 was heavily based on hard infrastructure development at home. Later on, once those companies were very adept at doing infrastructure and had run out of projects at home, they took their expertise overseas. And we saw a lot of that in the Latin American region in particular, but also all over the world. China was also experiencing excess capacity in the steel sector, which is heavily subsidized and will continue to be heavily subsidized under the current stimulus. And so as a result, has proposed a lot of projects that involve steel and that would require the exportation of Chinese steel to make them happen. One in particular, and this is a map that we put together, it's a bit dated, it's from 2018. These are projects that China has expressed interest in since 2002. The ones in light blue are just expressed interest. The ones in dark blue are underway. They've been developed entirely, are operational, or else there's a shovel in the ground and some progress is being made. But some of them, like the one that I don't know if you can see it very clearly on your screens, but there's one traversing, really running from Peru over to Brazil that's light blue. It's a railway. It's called the Trans-Pacific Transoceanic Railway. And this railway in particular, part of the impetus for this was to be able to, for it to be financed by Chinese companies, but with the condition of using Chinese steel, employing this excess capacity, in addition to a wide variety of other objectives, of course, that this particular railway would achieve. Somebody, speaking of infrastructure, is doing infrastructure outside of my window, so I hope you can still hear me despite that. Very timely. Beyond this, apologies. So I think, regardless of what we see in terms of stimulus in the coming months, we are likely to see probably some national champions emerge from this. Some of them will be the same companies that have been engaging Latin America for many, many years now, but there will be some others, not just in hard infrastructure necessarily, but in this new infrastructure, right? Things like 5G, smart cities, AI-enabled technologies, automation, electricity transmission, that will begin to go out when all is said and done, when China has recovered to a sufficient degree, and we'll probably see them active in Latin America if things resolve, in a timely way. Chinese innovations in these areas and the deployment of 5G, in the deployment of smart cities, especially as they gain this extra practice at home, will also eventually transcend China's borders and will have implications for Latin America, both positive and possibly also challenging in the coming months and years. So certainly China has already expressed considerable interest in 5G delivery in particular of infrastructure related to 5G for a number of years now. Beijing is also looking to boost Chinese trade at the moment. We've seen a resumption of commodities importation to a considerable degree, but China is now focused on boosting its exports. I showed you before that exports were an area of a challenging area and continue to be for China. And so it's set up at least 46 new integrated pilot zones for cross-border e-commerce. It's also supporting companies to build and share warehouses overseas for sort of joint production and to improve supply chains and delivery of essential goods. And is holding a number of online fairs, including some with Latin America. This took place about a month ago, I think. Yeah. And as a China Latin America International Trade Digital Expo, these were expos that were expected to be held in person, but have all been taken online. And according to Chinese media, at least, this particular expo was very, very successful and generated a number of new sort of transactions and commercial opportunities. So all of this should at least have some impact on China-Latin America trade relations in the coming months and years. Ideally also to the benefit of Latin American operators. And then I would say, that as the first country to grapple with COVID-19 and the first to emerge from the crisis, China is also in a unique position to provide medical supplies, knowledge also, and technologies to countries across the globe. At the same time, though, some in the region are reassessing their dependence on China or single markets in general for critical health and other national security related supplies. These sometimes conflicting factors could all result, I think, in some lasting changes in global pharmaceutical and other supply chains. And of course, it's important to keep a close eye on that to understand the effects of near sourcing, a push for near sourcing on the part of companies in different sectors. And finally, I would say within this sort of second area, right, China's approach to debt restructuring will also have some important implications for certain countries in the region. There are two countries that are among the more heavily indebted to China, Argentina and Ecuador. Of course, also Venezuela, but that even is a bit of an outlier. Argentina and Ecuador, their sort of debt that is owed to China is still a relatively small portion of their overall sovereign debt. So it wouldn't be hugely affected, a huge effect on their sort of economic development or prospects if China were to restructure that debt, but it would certainly be helpful. And both of these countries are in discussions, as I understand it, albeit limited ones, about the prospect of restructuring debt in some form. However, China has been pretty straightforward and limited in its approach to debt relief, but that could maybe change somewhat in the face of political pressure in the coming months, and perhaps as other countries, other institutions have discussions, really serious discussions about what it will take to get Latin American countries back on track, financially, fiscally, and in a place where they can begin to really recover in a wide range of ways. And then our third point, our sort of third factor that is likely to shape China-Latin America relations in the coming years, I think really much will depend on how the region ends up viewing China's handling of COVID-19. As we all know, the Trump administration has been very vocal in its criticism of China, both before COVID-19, of course, and now in the midst of the pandemic, essentially blaming China for the spread of the virus. And it's not really alone in this. We've seen other countries join in this criticism, adopting even some of the same language that the US is using. Certainly, Australia has done this to a degree within the Latin American region. Brazil really has in some cases even parroted what we've seen coming out of the Trump administration. And so there is some agreement, at least, on this point, if not, or else, a mutual effort to deflect attention away from what's happening domestically in these countries. At the same time, views of China in the US have worsened considerably during this presidency. And this you can see here on this particular slide. These are some recent findings, I believe, from April of 2020 from Pew Research. And you can see that there is really a considerable unfavorable impression among a number of different subgroups in the US, right? Including among Democrats, Republicans, those with college degrees, those with, with higher education degrees, and of, a wide range of age ranges. And these numbers are significantly worse for China than they were even a couple of years ago. So you can see really the deterioration of US-China relations is not just at the government level, among the leaders of the two countries, but really is happening at a lower level too among the populations. And this is something that we haven't typically seen in the past. Usually the tensions take place at a much higher level. To help, to the extent that, we see more of this rhetoric, and it's very likely that we do, it's worth wondering, or asking to what extent US messaging will have an effect on beliefs, on views of China in the region. And that's still a bit unclear, but certainly, as I mentioned, some countries have adopted a similar stance to the US, at least among the leaderships in those countries. To help ensure positive views, and this is a horrific slide, so please bear with me, but I'll explain to you what it is. To help ensure positive views of China and its role in the pandemic, China has donated extensive equipment to Latin America and also services. It's also sold a lot of equipment to the Latin American region really since about March. And these are, I just wanted to give you a sense of the scale of this activity. We've been tracking this all the way along, and we've tracked over 200 announcements, instances of donations or sales of medical equipment or diagnostic services to Latin America since March. There was some, very minor activity before March, but really between March and now mid-May, it's been a continuous donation of all sorts of different supplies. And here the color coding refers to different countries. So you can see that some countries are receiving a little bit more than others. But across the board, really, China has reached in some form nearly every country in the region. And this includes limited outreach to Taiwan's allies in the Northern Triangle in particular, also in the Caribbean, and to Paraguay, which is the only country in South America that has diplomatic ties to Taiwan rather than mainland China. In fact, a group of Paraguayan senators requested that the president cut ties with Taiwan a couple of months ago, noting the need to work more extensively with China on coronavirus relief. So we really are seeing, these efforts to engage more extensively with the region through so-called mask diplomacy as an effort not only to shape the narrative on China and the coronavirus, but also perhaps even to achieve other critical objectives, such as lessening Taiwan's influence in the Latin American and Caribbean region. Interestingly, in South America, Argentina has been among the top beneficiaries of China's mass diplomacy, but we've also seen a lot going to Brazil, including very recently, despite some real tensions between Brazil and China at the moment. As I kind of alluded to, in addition to these donations, Chinese diplomats have also sought to really shape the narrative on China and COVID-19. This is not just taking place in Latin America, but across the world. And here they insist that the origin of the virus is still unknown, although one particular Chinese diplomat in the foreign ministry has pointed directly to the US as the source of the virus. They indicate also that China handled the crisis responsibly, openly, and in a timely manner, and then that China is committed to helping the rest of the world get back on its feet. And China, of course, reinforced this commitment by offering to fund through the WHO, the World Health Organization, assistance, global assistance on COVID-19, helping with recovery across the world. In addition to the very concerted effort to spread these messages, often through social media, through op-eds, through calls to leaders, you name it, really a wide range of platforms, Chinese diplomats have also actively challenged any public commentary linking China to the pandemic. The Chinese embassy in Brazil publicly feuded with the Brazilian president's son and his education minister. Here you can see that Eduardo Bolsonaro, the son of the president of Brazil, blamed China very explicitly for the coronavirus, and also made some statements suggesting that China had controlled supply of protective equipment. And in response to this, the Chinese embassy also took to Twitter to suggest that Eduardo Bolsonaro had contracted a mental virus during a trip to the United States, noting the similarities between his narrative, his commentary, and that of some US officials. The Chinese embassy in Lima also lashed out at Peruvian writer Mario Vargas Llosa, very famous writer and member of the Inter-American Dialogue, for suggesting that the virus originated in China, and that a different system, a more democratic system, would have handled things a bit differently than China did at the onset of the outbreak. This is happening, of course, this effort to combat any sort of statements that are seen as erroneous is happening elsewhere in the world too, including in Europe and even Africa. This rather heavy-handed approach to narrative shaping is a very clear departure from the way that Chinese embassies have handled messaging in the past. It's a much more public and aggressive form of engagement. And is accompanied by the opening just very recently of a number of Twitter accounts on the part of Chinese embassies in March, April, May, to be able to communicate all of these messages very directly with local audiences. All of that said, I really do believe that Chinese diplomacy at the moment will, at the very least, showcase China's capacity for global leadership, and also highlight some of the more advanced medical and other technologies being developed by Chinese companies. Huawei is one of the main, a major Chinese telecommunications company, is one of the main providers of donations to the Latin American region. This is, of course, there is some altruism associated with these donations, and much of them are equipment, but others are, are PPE, for example, but others are AI-enabled platforms that really showcase China's and Huawei's in particular capacity in tech and in tech solutions. And I think part of the rationale is for these particular donations to perhaps be an entree, an opening for future investment, future cooperation with countries that may be interested in adopting Huawei's services in the coming years. And anecdotally, at least, I think there seems to be a real sense in the region that China, and not the US, has effectively taken the reins in this global response, and would likely effectively do so in future global responses to crises, to be they pandemics, something related to climate change, or any other large-scale disaster. And so I wonder what your impressions, of course, are on that as well. But certainly in my discussions across Latin America, that does appear to be the case. And I think I'll leave it there. I mean, there are many other factors, obviously, that are going to shape this relationship, and we can delve into those too. But let me stop there, and so we have sufficient time for Q&A.
Thank you, Margaret. It's an excellent presentation. So glad to hear you. I think I'll begin the questions right away, since the chat is full with good ideas and good comments. But first, I wanted to say thank you to Mark and to Tim and Carolina for inviting me to participate. I'm a native of Minnesota and a longtime member of Global Minnesota, and I really appreciate the opportunity to be involved. Some of the questions on the chat relate to the Belt and Road. Could you give us a little more detail about what the Belt and Road Initiative really means and what it looks like in Latin America? We understand it's rolled out in Africa and Europe, but how does it look in Latin America specifically? I think you're muted, Margaret.
Apologies. Let me unmute myself. Yeah, I mean, the Belt and Road. Yeah, I mean, it really came about, in 2013. It was intended as a Eurasian initiative to really extend infrastructure across the Eurasian region, and again, as I mentioned, to achieve a wide range of objectives. Some of them diplomatic in nature, some of them security related, some of them related to China's own economic objectives at home, right? The employment of excess capacity, providing opportunities for Chinese companies that didn't have as many opportunities at home anymore, investing China's reserves in a way that would attract, higher returns than maybe investing at home. So really wide-ranging objectives. And since then, though, has really grown to become a really global initiative. It's focused, as I said, on infrastructure, but also connectivity in a wide variety of different ways. People-to-people ties, financial integration, digital integration. And so we're seeing this sort of activity really becoming increasingly pervasive in a global way. Latin America was the very last region to be incorporated in the Belt and Road Initiative. It was in 2018, after the Arctic. So that gives you a sense of where Latin America falls in terms of China's broader global, foreign policy priorities. But it's still a very important region and helps China to achieve a number of objectives. The Belt and Road, I mean, it's unclear what's going to happen with the Belt and Road now, right? There are these deals, these many deals that have been struck, in countries across the world, including in Latin America. Many of them are officially called Belt and Road projects, right? Big infrastructure, large scale stuff, are on hold. There's not a lot of talk about them right now. And so much will depend, on whether the deals themselves will support some of China's reforms or help boost Chinese growth at home. And whether the companies, that are responsible for carrying them out are going to be financially healthy enough to actually do that. It will also depend so much on what's happening on the ground in any given country. If there is chaos, if it's an unsafe environment, if the focus is otherwise, then we may not see those move forward in a real way. But we have seen, if China keeps focusing on steel and supplementing steel at home, which is, they just announced today they're going to do it in an even greater way. China's going to need to be able to use that steel, employ it somewhere, and get some form of return, right? And doing that overseas through rail development and the other things of that nature might still be a major motivator for BRI expansion.
Right. And there's been some controversy when China goes into other countries with development projects, they don't use local labor. Is that the case for Latin America, and do you see that changing?
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly been an issue in the past. That really depends on the laws in a host country, on how strict they are about the use of local labor, on local content, right? On all of these things, and also how much leverage these countries have when negotiating certain projects with China. If you're Brazil, where you have very, very strong local content regulations and stipulations, right, and very strong labor stipulations, and you're a big economy, and China needs to work with you more, you're going to be in a better position to negotiate some of these things than perhaps the Bahamas. And the Bahamas was one of the more egregious examples of the importation of Chinese low-skill labor for jobs that could have been done by people in the Bahamas, right? A wide range of people in the Bahamas. But still, yeah, we see a lot of Chinese labor coming. Most of it at this point, given the fact that it's not really a good image builder for China to bring tons of workers, and they're very aware of that. Most of it is at the sort of managerial level.
Right. Excellent. There's several questions in the chat about, although this topic is China and Latin America, about the United States. It's hard to ignore the United States presence in the hemisphere in the world. And China and the United States have not had a good relationship over the past 4 years, most people would agree. What about after the election, if there were a new administration? Are Latin Americans looking forward to having a change? or perhaps maybe they're benefiting a little bit from some of the trade conflict between the United States and China, and stepping up and stepping in where others are not.
Yeah, I mean, a sort of worst case scenario for Brazil, I think, at this point is if this phase one agreement were to actually go through, right? So it's unclear whether that's going to happen. Certainly, some of Trump's most recent tweets suggest that that may very well not. We may not have a relationship with China at all. Was one of them suggested that more recently. Yeah, so I think regardless, China is certainly looking forward to maybe a change in administration, but it's unclear, I think, to them what entirely that would look like, given that there is real agreement, bipartisan agreement on the need to be tougher on China. In a wide variety of ways, and to sort of rebalance the relationship. Certainly, Democrats tend to take a bit of a different approach to this than Republicans, but I do think if we had, a Biden administration, there would still be a tougher stance on China than perhaps we've seen before, pre-Trump. I do believe, the trade situation would resolve somewhat. That I don't think that we would have the same sort of, extensive tariffs. There would be, I think, an immediate effort to try to address some of the trade stipulations, some of the tariffs that have been put in place that are perceived to be damaging certain sectors here in the United States, or else to push forward at least certain phases of the existing agreement. But overall, I mean, even among Biden, supporters and those who have worked for Biden in the past, there is a lot of support for a very tough approach to China, and for ensuring that this level playing field language is something that goes way earlier than the Trump administration, right? Looking for a reciprocity, for an even playing field, ensuring that U.S. companies, but also other international companies, are able to compete in a fair and effective way in Latin America and other regions, by ensuring a higher degree of transparency and making sure that Latin American countries are able to negotiate effectively and can hold any company accountable, be it a Chinese one or otherwise, for the deals that are being struck. And so we'll see. I do believe those particular initiatives, which are ongoing under the Trump administration, would be continued to a degree.
Okay, sticking with the United States with this next question, does the United States put too much emphasis on human rights when it comes to China?
Oh, that's well, certainly at the
I knew
moment.
I'd get you with that.
Certainly at the moment, we're not putting much emphasis on human rights at all. Although it is a bit of this, it's been a bit baffling to me, frankly. Very selective, right, approach to emphasizing human rights. A real focus on Xinjiang, for example, right, the sort of Western autonomous region where Uyghurs have been treated badly by Chinese officials, and there are a lot of reports of human rights abuses. That's been a sticking point for the Trump administration, and one that they've highlighted. But then many others they've chosen to ignore, not just in China and but other regions as well. I do think that at least that I do think we will resume that same rhetoric, that same position that we saw during the Obama administration and even previous presidencies with respect to human rights. That really hasn't changed all that much. But certainly, I mean, Trump's advisors, those that are Trump's China advisors in particular, Navarro and many others, have suggested that yes, indeed, we have paid too much attention to human rights at the detriment of other points of leverage and other things that actually can be accomplished to make the relationship a more balanced one. I don't have a great answer, personal great answer to that question, but I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, uneven as usual, I would say, right? And when we think about Minnesota and its relations with Latin America, we think of trade. Mexico is our second largest trading partner. It's very significant, a destination for agricultural products, for example. We have a question here about the new NAFTA, the USMCA. How does that affect China? And maybe throwing in another one of these is sort of how does the post-pandemic supply chain world affect the opportunities for, say, Minnesota companies to start manufacturing closer to home instead of China? Is there going to be a surge of manufacturing into Mexico from Asia? What's your sense of those two things, the USMCA and how China views that, and then how the supply chains and global production might be reshifting?
Yeah, I don't see, I mean, frankly, I don't see a huge change in the way that China would have, used or taken advantage of the old NAFTA agreement into the US, the new USMCA. Aside from the fact that I do think, I mean, China is a major, or a major producer of some of the intermediate goods that are, of course, used in automobile manufacturers in Mexico and all over the world. So far, under NAFTA, there was a situation in which a lot of the sourcing was coming from Mexico, from tier one producers in the automotive industry in Querétaro or wherever else. Due to some of the new stipulations, especially with respect to as I understand, and I'm sure there are some of you on here that are much better experts than I am on this particular topic, but pickup trucks and things like this that will make it absolutely impossible because of punitive measures if you do not source from within NAFTA to produce these things at cost, right, and at an efficient cost and efficiently and be able to sell them. And so I do think in those particular instances, we'll see more sourcing potentially from China. We've also seen China investing in Mexico, particularly to take advantage of these agreements. And I think under the current USMCA, there would be a similar draw. But yeah, in Mexico, there are, Mexico is well equipped, as I understand it, to be able to produce things like PPE and other sort of really critical supplies. And to the extent that there is more of an emphasis on near sourcing to be able to reduce any risk in supply chains. And this conversation is an important one. It's ongoing, and certainly this won't be the last crisis, that we all encounter. Then I think Mexico is especially well positioned to potentially benefit from that. Of course, there are conditions that need to be in place to make that happen, but certainly, I think there are a lot of opportunities for Mexico and for companies here in the U.S. to think about certain partners in the Latin American region that would be, valuable partners in terms of diversifying supply chains overall.
Right, excellent. You mentioned technology in your presentation a number of times, and I've read that China has made it a goal to be a leader in artificial intelligence by 2030. And I've read that Vladimir Putin has said that whoever dominates AI dominates the rest of the century. Do you agree with that? Do you see Latin America being sort of caught in the middle between global powers in the rates for AI and advanced technologies? And there's a specific follow-up question here about aeronautics technologies in specific. Is that a priority for China in acquiring best technologies? Is that something it's after in Latin America and wishes to acquire?
Mm. I wonder if that's with respect to Brazil, perhaps, or
I'm sensing so. Yes.
So yeah,
Brazil.
yeah. On the first question, I agree with you. Yeah, I mean, the AI is the future. When I read my, stories about how robots are taking over the world. No, certainly whoever dominates AI, and AI is going to be affecting everything we do, Internet of Things. I mean, automation, everything, AI will be involved and already is to a considerable degree. And so, yes, I mean, and China is making major advances in this area. There are plenty of debates about who is the global leader at this point in this particular area, but certainly the race is ongoing. And China, I think, has, especially in certain types of technologies and applications, is far ahead of many others, including, for example, surveillance technologies and facial identification and a number of other areas. So what does that mean for Latin America? I mean, it could mean great things. It could mean wonderful things if some of these AI applications are applied in ways that are boosting to local economies or are promoting of development or of social advances. It could also just be that the Latin American region is a consumer of these products. It's a market for whatever China is producing without much benefit locally, and with really so much of the sort of power that one has with respect to sort of AI technologies is in the data itself. So if there is no way for these Latin American countries, or the regulations are there, if the are not there, if the conditions are not there to ensure that Latin America retains, some sovereignty over its own data, or else, experiences a degree of technology transfer to be able to also benefit from the technologies themselves and from the creation or maintenance of these technologies, then the actual benefit will be far more limited than it could possibly be. So it's a real exercise in thinking about best policy practices and how to implement those before it's too late, because this is happening very, very quickly.
Excellent. We have a large Ecuadorian population in Minnesota. I forget the number, but it's well over 20,000 Ecuadorians live here. We have established and successful businesses founded by Ecuador. And we had actually a Consul General, Silvia Ontaneda, here, who did a great job for a number of years representing Ecuador. So it's not surprising we have a question about Ecuador on the roster, but it's very specific. It's on the multicolor slide that you had on medical products. Do you have an idea of what share Ecuador was getting of that pie in compared to others?
Yeah, I mean, I think there were 5 transactions, if I remember, something in that range, 5 or 6. It's much smaller than, it was about the same amount as Bolivia. But bigger obviously than Central America, bigger than the Caribbean islands, but small in comparison to other countries in South America. Venezuela, I don't have great data there, but Venezuela is fairly limited too, as far as I could tell.
Right. And then
and I'm happy to send that actual data. Yeah.
Oh, that'd be fantastic. I'm sure that looked like you need a magnifying glass to really dig into.
Yeah, it was more illustrative than
Right. Another question that comes up is criticism about China's environmental record in the region. That was in the headlines when Brazil had its Amazon fires. And there's a lot of pointing fingers, I guess, across the world against each other. Just tell us more about the environmental situation in Latin America as it relates to China's involvement, U.S. involvement. And one of the questions here puts it well, do we have any real choice other than finding a way to get along with China? So maybe you could talk a little bit about some of the international rancor and how you see that. Who's the good guy when it comes to Latin America and China and the U.S. and environmental concerns?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that either the U.S. or China is a poster child in this particular respect, right, at the moment. And there are, I mean, when you speak with environmentalists in the region and here in the U.S. too, there is considerable frustration with both governments, both countries, and their track records and what they're doing at home, and then also their lack of support for these major activities or crises, addressing these crises abroad. So what can be done? Yes, I mean, Latin America has very little choice but to get along with China and the United States, frankly. I mean, both are critical economic partners, political partners even in some cases. And so, it's challenging for these countries because they're walking a fine line between the two. On the environmental side, it's more about creating the conditions, frankly, at home to ensure that whatever actor is involved, whatever investment is made, whatever decision is made at home by whatever sort of interest group, that it will be very hard to have a considerable impact on the environment, or at least in terms of investments, that there's a really extensive review process in place, and a strong enough civil society and a strong enough regulatory capacity to be able to ensure that that the environmental impact assessments are done well and are shared, they are transparent, that there are enough eyes on the ground when the project is actually happening, that there are partners involved, that there is an independent review of the project, at different phases in its development, that the finance, whether it comes from China or from anywhere else, has certain conditions attached to it, environmentally and socially, right? All of these things really need to be in place. And when they are in place in Latin America, the outcomes tend to be pretty okay. When they're not, though, we've had some real disasters. And, in places like, it's not just about them being on the books, right? These regulations being on the books, but about them being enforced. And so there needs to be, enough pressure and accountability and transparency and agreement on all of this for best outcomes. And that's not necessarily an easy thing to accomplish, especially when countries are going to be trying really hard to grow economically again. And I think the environmental situation will worsen as a result of that. Already we're seeing backsliding in certain regulations. There are ways, though, and there are groups also in China, that are working really hard to make this happen on the Chinese side. So partnerships with them is also quite critical.
Well, that's wonderful to hear. We've got more questions, but we've run out of time.